Hello and welcome back to the channel. For anyone who's not been living under or who has been living under a rock or in the middle of the jungle somewhere, Putin and Russia has invaded Ukraine. This obviously is the big news story right now and obviously dramatic to put it mildly. But I want to talk about something a little bit different in relation to that. I want to look forward to the future because there will be a future one day. I am making the assumption here that Putin wants to to achieve his objectives. And I don't believe his objectives are perpetual war. This may be a naive assumption on my part, but I can't see how he can get what he wants by being at war all the time. So at some point in the future, there is going to have to be some kind of negotiated settlement. And as with anything when it comes to negotiation, preparation is your best friend. Now you'll have to excuse the title. I don't think anyone would imagine Putin to be described as an appeaser. That is just a little bit of typical British humour on my part. But let's today talk about Putin and what anyone negotiating with him in the future should think about in terms of negotiation principles. I am the collaborative negotiator, a professional negotiator of over 10 years of experience, and in this channel I like to talk about negotiation principles, things that people need to understand prior to going into any negotiation so that they can prepare themselves well for it. So let's take a little bit of a stab at what it might be like, no pun intended of course, to negotiate with Putin. So in the future, we're going to have to think, as I always do with any negotiation, what are the objectives? What is it that anyone entering into negotiation wants to achieve? So whatever the outcome is in Ukraine, whether Ukraine force back Russian forces, whether Russian take the whole of Ukraine or just hold the east of it, the fighting will perhaps come to not an end maybe, but an uneasy truce maybe, or an easy stalemate. So at which point, various people are going to have to sit in front of Putin, diplomats, and say, what's the way out of this dilemma that you put us into? So as part of that, people need to have a think about what are the objectives that they want to achieve in those sorts of scenarios. And we're having to be very speculative here because obviously the Ukraine conflict is very much underway at the moment. The outcome is far from settled. And that is important, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But anyone sitting opposite Putin, what are they going to be pushing for? One option is a return to the status quo. That Russia pulls back its forces to its side of the border, and Ukraine carries on as it was before. Now, whilst this is quite appealing on many levels, there are certain problems with this. Which is the status quo is what got us into this mess in the first place. So if your objective is to achieve the status quo prior to the conflict breaking out, you are not solving any problems in the long term. You are just temporarily ceasing hostilities and kicking the can down the road, in a sense. Putin still has what he considers his issues, and they don't go away if you return to the status quo. So there has to be some kind of change. Now, of course, if Putin gets deposed and replaced by somebody else, that is a dramatic change, and maybe the status quo might be a more viable option in that scenario. But right here, right now, the status quo can only be seen as a temporary step, not as a long-term solution. So what else could we look for? Well, if Russia loses badly, let's say Ukraine forces Russian forces all the way back to the Russian border, then that puts Russia and Putin in a very difficult position. And at which point Ukraine and the West can perhaps push for an enhanced position. They can obviously demand concessions as a consequence of Russian aggression. Maybe that the reverse is true as well. If Russia successfully captured the entirety of Ukraine, they might push for an enhanced position, although I suspect that would be an interesting sell, it's somewhat difficult. So this is where I come to things like balance of power, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. But right here, the outcome of the Ukraine can decide, or the current conflict in Ukraine can decide whether the objective is going to be a status quo with a longer term negotiation plan, or whether there's the option of an enhanced position, where you firmly perhaps pin one side or the other into accepting a new position, quite simply because they lost. One thing the negotiations won't be is punitive. I want to make that point, regardless of what happens. Punishing someone is something you do. It is not something you negotiate. No one negotiates to be punished. So you can, I suppose, in some ways negotiate to reduce the severity of the punishment, but that's more towards going for an enhanced position. You're trying to secure things from them, and you'll punish various actions if they don't agree to your demands. But actual punitive measures are just something you do or threaten. They won't form any part of any negotiated outcome. And it's important to make that distinction. You don't negotiate any punishment. That's the key. And another option that simply cannot be ruled out is damage limitation. So it is not inconceivable that Russian forces will hold chunks of Ukraine post conflict calming down. They may completely refuse to budge. Putin may refuse to budge from that. So what is the negotiated outcome in that scenario? Unless NATO decides to launch a war against Russia, then you're in a position of trying to negotiate damage limitation. So it's worth bearing these things in mind. Now, I've talked about balance of power, and I've talked about that before in the past, and this is important here, especially with someone like Putin, who is very much about wealth and power. These will be important considerations for him, and it's important to understand the balance of power when you're attempting to negotiate with him. For the starting point, of course, whatever is the military outcome of Ukraine. If Russia loses, the balance of power shifted more towards the West. If Russia wins Ukraine, I'm not too sure what the hell win looks like, but if they successfully overrun and control Ukraine, then to a certain extent the balance of power does shift towards Russia's favour, Ukraine. I say unless NATO and the West are willing to escalate very dramatically. And of course there will be consequences for doing that. And this will certainly be in Putin's mind in terms of the balance. And he may feel threatened if he doesn't feel the balance is in his favour. And if he does feel the balance is in his favour, he is going to be pushing himself for an enhanced negotiation position. So we have to bear that in mind. That will be the first thing. The next thing would of course be the impact of sanctions on Russia, particularly those on Putin. And the purpose of these sanctions actually in many ways, not apart from punitive, which obviously where people think about, politicians talk about, but the actual longer term purpose of a sanction is to shift the balance of power. So even if, for example, the Russians achieve their objective militarily that is set in Ukraine, you can reduce their perceived balance of power advantage by imposing such crippling sanctions that the economic cost to Russia is phenomenal. And that puts them into a weakened position. And of course, this will start to be a very key issue when talking about gas supplies and gas prices and so on. And of course, the amount of wealth held by Putin. The other thing not to underestimate is Putin's power base. The impact of sanctions make Russian population deeply dissatisfied with what Putin has done. That again will shift the balance of power in the West's favour. and put Putin in a vulnerable and weak position. That could be dangerous. I shall digress on that one. But it's important to bear that in mind. So that all these sanctions, applied properly, they're not there just to punish. They're there to actually improve the longer-term negotiation position. But this can swing the other way, because of course those sanctions will have an economic impact on everyone else as well. Does it weaken their position? And the classic example right now, of course, is Germany, and Germany's reliance, or need rather, for gas. So that has created a reliance on the Russian pipeline. However, and this is perhaps where we go past sanctions, the Germans can redress that balance of power if they take themselves off Russian gas. So let's say, for example, they sign a nice new lucrative deal with a Middle Eastern country or whoever, or the US even, that supplies them with all their gas needs. That takes the power away from Putin. He can no longer use that as economic leverage against Germany. So there's a variety of things that people need to think about when it comes to balance of power and in terms of the strategic decision that need to be made, not only in terms of the impact now, but the future impact on their ability to deal with Putin once the fighting stops. So all of these things need to be borne in mind. The other option, well, the other thing is unity. There are power in numbers, and the EU and NATO have talked about this consistently. And this will be key, and it will be difficult to sustain complete harmony, complete alignment amongst all the nations. They have competing interests. Germany and gas, for example, and Italy's also extensive business dealing with Russia. These are classic examples. And it's not just for a question for Europe as well. It's a question for how Europe might want to be able to work with China or India or any of those other countries there. Because if they can sustain some form of unity with the European and NATO position, then that again shifts the balance of power away from Putin in all negotiations. Another aspect is credible escalation. So would that be NATO going in militarily? That is certainly an escalation, but is it credible? I leave that as a question. What is certainly credible as escalation is, for example, further punitive measures, shutting off Russia from just about everything, for example, the SWIFT banking system. That is quite a dramatic escalation, and that's an option that the EU has been reluctant to exercise at this point. I can understand that, because sometimes the threat of doing something so severe is more important than actually doing it. But that only works if it's taken credibly. So, and this can go the other way as well. I talked before about Putin perhaps being very dangerous if he feels weakened. And this is because he had already made indirect threats to escalate the conflict if anyone interferes with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Does that mean he will use nukes? The implication, which certainly seems to be, but again, just how crazy is he, I suppose is the question. How credible is that threat of escalation, particularly if it can be countered by all the other nations also armed with nuclear weapons who will say, don't even think about it. So that's an escalation path that no one wants to go down. But there's other routes, and people will have to make very interesting judgments as how far you can push those other escalation methods before it triggers the wrong type of escalation, shall we say, particularly when it comes to the nuclear kind. And finally, and this should not be underestimated, the power of endurance. This war is going to cost everybody. It's going to cost Russians in terms of military expenditure. It's going to cost their economy in terms of the direct sanctions and indirect impact of people refusing to deal with Russia. And it's going to cost everyone else who needs to sort out their supply chain, pay higher prices for gas, whatever. So the question then becomes, who can last longer? So if the pressure can be brought on Russia to the point that all their reserves will be drained well before anyone else's, then that shifts the balance of power again away from Putin. But if he believes, and particularly because he had done a very successful job of suppressing democracy in Russia, that he can endure for the long term due to his hold on power, his ability to control the information that's given to the Russian population, then he may just try and play the long game and hold out and refuse to compromise in order to improve his odds, to bring, for example, Europe into a position of being desperate enough for gas that they'll finally negotiate with him on more favourable terms. So these are all the questions that need to be asked as part of the balance of power. However, there is one more thing that needs to be talked about here as a negotiation principle that completely throws the balance of power dynamics out of the window. And this is something that perhaps people don't talk enough about, including professional negotiators. One of the things I like to stress is that it is absolutely critical during any negotiation to understand the other side's red lines. And I always talk about genuine red line, not fake or pretend red lines. And one of the things that you tend to find that people have red lines on are matters of principle. People do not want to compromise on principle. Now, principles come from a variety of directions. They can come from religious belief. They can come from what is culturally accepted, what has been taught, what someone feels extremely strongly about. The principle doesn't necessarily have to be rational, but it is there. And the key thing to understand that when someone articulates a principle is that that principle rarely is open to negotiation. So what that means is that you have to find ways around it, or through it, maybe. Now, either you accept that that is a red line principle and say, okay, what can we do to achieve our objectives, but without breaching that principle? Simple one. But sometimes that's not possible. And this is where the concept of compromise comes in. Because if you need someone to compromise on that principle in order, because let's say you think that principle is just ridiculous, it's not possible to reach a negotiated outcome if that principle is stuck to absolutely rigidly. You can't negotiate directly to change that principle. So what you need to do is reframe how the other side perceives that principle. You need to manipulate them a little bit in a way. You need to make them think differently about that issues. And there's a whole variety of techniques and stuff that, psychology that goes into that. I'm not going to go into that in this video. But the point I want to make is that Putin himself is a very principled individual. And I don't mean principled in the honest, decent type sense. I mean principled as in dogmatic. No one will shift his mind. He believes what he believes. He perhaps genuinely does believe that Ukraine is full of neo-Nazis. Who knows? But the whole point is that Putin is the sort of person that sticks to what he believes in. And what that means is that he is an utterly dreadful person to negotiate against. There is no compromise in the man. And as I said, principles can come from a variety of sources. It can be because of belief, of religion, but it can also be because of the way the brain is formed. And the brain can be formed in undesirable ways. I know various people have made the case that Putin is a bit psychotic, sociopathic, and whatever, and that may be a part of this. But either way, the issue remains. Now, Putin has invaded Ukraine ostentatiously as a matter of principle. The principle that Russia is being threatened, Russia is being undermined, and everyone else is untrustworthy. Now, he may be completely deranged. You may think his worldview is completely nuts, and of course many people do. But because he holds those as principles, you have to understand that you're going up against a brick wall when it comes to negotiating with him. Now, this poses a dilemma for the West. So whatever the outcome is of Ukraine, militarily speaking, what do you do? So let's say Russia has lost Ukraine, but Putin will have not changed his principle that Ukraine should not go to the West, perhaps. So what do you do about that? Because if you don't recognize that principle, then you open up the likelihood that Putin will escalate, unless you can put in a counter-escalation. And this is crucial, because the principle for the West here has been about democracy, national sovereignty. And that is where the West's principles directly conflicts with Putin's principles. Because Putin has believed that to achieve his principles, he doesn't like democracy. Democracy means that people keep making decisions that don't agree with what he wants. They don't do what he wants them to do. So he doesn't seem very fond of democracy. But of course the West is. So anything that Putin wants is likely to be detrimental to Ukrainian democracy, full stop. So the West has to understand that. And this is when it comes to setting the objectives. They have to understand how far they're willing to fight for that principle, to defend it. Because it's not good enough just to say we want a peaceful outcome to what has happened in Ukraine. Also have to understand this tension of principles. Because we can talk about balance of power and compromise all we like, but all of that goes out of the window if somebody is so dogmatic they refuse to move their position as a matter of principle. Now, there's a little lesson from history in this, and I thought I'd touch upon this. Neville Chamberlain was the British Prime Minister who negotiated with Adolf Hitler prior to the outbreak of World War II. Now, Hitler was, of course, being extremely aggressive. He's another person with obviously various psychopathic, sociopathic type tendencies. And again, he was a very dogmatic individual. Again, like Putin, he believed he had principles. The Greater Germany, whatever, onto the hatred of Jews, all the other bits and pieces. Pretty horrible ideology, but to him, matters of principle. Now, Neville Chamberlain came at those negotiations with Hitler from a very different set of principles. He didn't want war. And he was prepared to try and achieve that objective at almost any cost. So there were the infamous negotiations at Munich, where Neville Chamberlain negotiated with Hitler that he could have Czechoslovakia as long as he dropped his claims on everywhere else. So to Neville Chamberlain, he was sticking to his principles of no war, if you like. However, he sacrificed the principle of national sovereignty for Czechoslovakia to achieve that. So he basically betrayed them. He betrayed a country in his mind for the greater good. Now the problem with that is that, of course, we all know the story. Hitler took Czechoslovakia without a fight, but then decided afterwards that no, that wasn't enough. And it all came to a head when he invaded Poland. At which point, Chamberlain realized that he had been duped. Because here's the fundamental problem. If you negotiate with someone who isn't willing to stick with it, then it is no longer a compromise. Chamberlain believed he had reached a compromise with Hitler. But Hitler was so unreliable, so dogmatic, that he just breached that agreement anyway. And so it no longer became a compromise. It became appeasement. And this is why I highlight the whole principle about whatever comes next for Ukraine. People have to understand the concept of principles, both Putin's and that for the West. Because if you don't stick to the principles, if you don't stick to your red lines, an individual like Putin, and he's not alone, but an individual like Putin would do exactly as Hitler did. Tell you what you want to hear, give the impression of reaching a compromise, but actually would just go and take what they want anyway, because they are so dogmatic. And when you're in that scenario, you should not negotiate in a collaborative sense. You have to understand you're in an adversarial negotiation, and you're in a negotiation where you do not trust the other side, and where any compromise you give must be extremely narrow and carefully measured, with plenty of root behind it, plenty of muscle behind it for credible escalation in order to enforce it, to enforce the agreement, essentially. So what does this mean going forward? Whatever happened to Ukraine, and obviously, like everybody else, I hope the situation there improves considerably for Ukraine, mainly that obviously the Russians pull out and leave them alone. But there we go. But whatever happened, there's going to have to be some kind of negotiated outcome, some kind of negotiated resolution to the scenario that results from that invasion. One scenario is some form of compromise. The West, NATO, and Russia reach some kind of compromise agreement. For example, and I'm not suggesting this is what should be agreed, I'm just using an example, that Ukraine remains a sovereign independent territory, but doesn't join NATO, doesn't join Russia, for example, remains in that little sort of in-between buffer state. Maybe the compromise can be they can join the EU but can't join NATO, can't be armed or whatever. Some form of, no one's going to be happy, but that would be a compromise outcome. The other outcome is capitulation or appeasement. And that can go either way. Russia could lose the war, they would have to capitulate to the West's demands. Or Russia wins the war, refuses to negotiate any kind of reasonable position, and for the sake of not having further war, further conflict, NATO and the West agrees to some elements of Putin's demands or accepts that new status quo. That would be appeasement. That is one potential outcome. And another one, and this is where the issue of principles comes back in, there simply is no ability to reach compromise. The war becomes a stalemate, if you like, in Ukraine, or even just an uneasy peace. And what you have here is perpetual adversity. Neither side is willing to compromise. Neither side is willing to, bridge their principles. And so you cannot really reach agreement. You can only accept the situation as it is and constantly push back against it. Not necessarily directly, quite often indirectly. And I fear that with how dogmatic Putin is, and the fact that what he wants is very much against what the West holds dear in terms of principles and democracy, means that this is the most likely outcome that will result from Ukraine. But we shall see. It's going to be an unpleasant period of time for several months, I would say. But at some point in the future, there will have to be diplomacy when the fighting calms down. And I do hope that people understand these concepts. But people must also understand that if agreement cannot be reached, these are the reasons why. Because perhaps it just was not possible. Perhaps this fact that we are going to now be in perpetual adversity with Russia is going to be the new status quo. If that is going to be the new reality, that will be a sad situation. But the important thing to remember, the negotiation is not about achieving agreement. Negotiation is about achieving an objective. And if you cannot negotiate an acceptable objective from the other side, then you have to walk away or hold the line, as it were. And if that is the result, then that needs to be communicated, and everybody needs to understand that and support those who are holding the line and fighting for those principles. So I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope it explained some of the future negotiation concepts that will be coming. And yes, I look forward to seeing some of the comments down below.